Now we're going to start on a new section on endgame training. There are two endgame books that I highly recommend if you're interested in increasing your endgame knowledge, which is highly recommended. First one is Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual, 2nd edition. The second endgame manual I recommend is Silman's Complete Endgame Course from Beginner to Master by Jeremy Silman. This is a newer book than the Dvoretsky's book. Either one is highly recommended. Our first subject will be called Square of the Pawn. When an enemy pawn is trying to outrace your king down the board, it's always nice to be able to see with a glance if you or your opponent can draw. Sadly, most players, including myself, feel that they must do the old he goes there and I go there routine for endless series of moves, see if their king can make it back in time to stop an unescorted enemy pawn. How many of us think, if I go here, he goes there, then I go there, he goes there, I move there, he moves there, I move there, he moves there, and I can catch him. I've done that quite a bit, actually. But fortunately, there is an easier way. In this position, in which White's king is far from the action, poses a simple question. Can Black's king stop or even win the enemy pawn? The game hangs in the balance. If the Black king can stop the pawn, then the game is drawn, while the game is lost if the king can't. The answer lies in a technique called the square of the pawn. The normally invisible square of the pawn is drawn and clear for all to see. How does one create such a square? Here's the trick. In the direction of the stalking king, draw a diagonal extension from the pawn to the end of the board. Then draw a rank extension from the side of the pawn to the file where the diagonal extension ended. In this case, that would be the E file, since the diagonal extension ended at E8. Connect all the lines, then you get the square. Just like that. Black to move. He steps into the square. The pawn moves up. And you can always draw a new square anytime. The more you practice this, the more it'll be much easier to automatically be able to see just with your eyes. He moves into the square. The pawn doesn't have a chance. And it's a draw. The rule is, if Black's king can step into this square, it will stop the pawn. If it can't, the pawn will keep on going. Now let's go back. If it was White's move, A5 is the winner, because a new square would be created. And black is unable to step into the square. Therefore, white will be able to promote and win. And just like that. Now, let's look at a new variation. We have white's pawn on b3. We draw our square. Black to move. He gets inside the square, either g3 or g4. And it's draw. If it's white's move, then after b4, the side of the new square becomes the F file. Which black's king cannot reach in time. And white wins. And finally, if the pawn stood on b2, then because the pawn can move 2 squares, the square would still be constructed from the b3 square. Therefore, b4 the king cannot catch, and white wins again. This concludes the section of the square of the pawn. Remember the rule. If the king can step into the square, it will stop the pawn. If it can't, you won't. Goodbye.